My father was standing outside my gate when I saw the message. My phone lit up with a text I never expected. Jillian, we need to talk. I'm outside. I am Jillian, 28, a business owner sitting inside my $2 million villa in Naples, Florida. Glancing at the security monitor, I watched the man pacing aggressively in front of my wrought iron gates. He looked frantic, staring through the bars like he owned the place. 8 years ago, this same man walked out of the hospital right before my life-threatening surgery. He didn't stay to make sure I survived. Instead, he boarded a luxury cruise with his other son, leaving me to face my darkest moment alone. Now, after spotting photos of my success and this estate on Facebook, he suddenly decided it was time for a reunion. I didn't tremble. I didn't rush to the door, nor did I cry. I simply locked my phone and looked toward my living room. Inside, a very special surprise was already waiting for him. If you have ever had someone come back only after they saw what you built without them, stay with me. Like this video, subscribe, and tell me what time it is and which city you're watching from so I know how far my story has traveled. Because this started in a hospital room and ended at the front door of the house my father thought he could walk into. 8 years earlier, I still believed my father kept his promises. I was 22, staring down a terrifying spinal surgery that had a high risk of complications. The doctors had carefully explained the procedure, the recovery time, and the very real possibility of permanent nerve damage. I only asked one thing of my father, Alan, to be there. He had sworn he would drive me to the hospital, sit in the waiting room until the doctors gave the all clear, and safely bring me home when I was discharged. It seemed like a simple, reasonable request from a parent. However, the timing clashed with a highly anticipated vacation. Valerie and her son Ryan were in a frenzy preparing for a massive luxury cruise. The house was filled with the sounds of zippers closing on luggage and discussions about tropical itineraries. Alan was heavily involved in their preparations, almost as if trying to distract himself from my procedure. I clearly remember watching from the hallway as he meticulously checked Ryan's passport for the third time, making sure it was safely tucked into a travel wallet. A moment later, I saw Alan confidently hand over his premium credit card to pay for an exclusive scuba diving excursion. He told Valerie that this trip was incredibly important for Ryan to relax. I tried not to demand too much attention during those chaotic days. I kept my anxiety to myself, rationalizing that they could still go on their scheduled vacation while my father fulfilled his promise to me. I didn't need any grand display of affection. I just desperately needed him to be present on the day of the operation. When the dreaded morning finally arrived, Alan drove me to the medical center. He seemed uncharacteristically quiet, his fingers tapping anxiously against the steering wheel. As he pulled up to the drop-off zone, he didn't turn off the engine. He told me to go ahead and check in, promising he would go park the car and immediately meet me on the surgical floor. I nodded silently, grabbed my small overnight bag, and walked through the sliding glass doors alone. I filled out the endless paperwork and changed into the scratchy hospital gown. Nurse Briggs, a kind woman with gentle, understanding eyes, began prepping my IV lines. The room felt freezing, and the harsh fluorescent lights only amplified my nervous shaking. She paused her careful work, looking toward the empty doorway of my cubicle, and softly asked where my family was. I swallowed the heavy lump in my throat, offering a weak excuse about parking issues and traffic outside the clinic. Hours later, the heavy fog of anesthesia slowly began to lift. I woke up in the dimly lit recovery room. The rhythmic beeping of medical monitors echoed in my ears. As my blurry vision cleared, my eyes instinctively darted to the visitor's chair situated right beside my bed. It was completely empty. There was no jacket draped over the back, no discarded magazine left on the armrest. A nurse noticed I was awake and carefully handed me my personal belongings. I reached for my phone with shaking fingers. There was no missed call, only a single brief text message from Alan. Ryan needed me on the ship. You're strong, you understand, right? I read the cold words 3 times, letting the harsh reality wash over me. The intense physical pain from the surgical incision was absolutely nothing compared to the crushing weight settling in my chest. In that quiet, sterile room, the truth became undeniably clear. I was not his priority. I would never be his priority. And I was truly alone. By the time I could drive again, Alan had already found a way to make my recovery about him. My slow, agonizing healing process took place inside the cramped, poorly insulated walls of a tiny third-floor apartment. I navigated the challenging physical therapy sessions entirely on my own, gritting my teeth through the lingering, sharp nerve pain that radiated down my spine every single morning. I slowly learned to walk across the living room without assistance, cook my own simple meals, and eventually returned to my demanding office job. Throughout those difficult months, a brief, fading memory of Janet would sometimes cross my mind, her quiet voice reminding me that self-reliance was the only true safety net I would ever have. I clung to that thought as I drove myself to every follow-up doctor's appointment, determined to rebuild my strength. Then, out of the blue, my phone rang. It was Alan. He didn't offer a tearful apology or express any profound regret for his prolonged absence. Instead, his tone was heavy, burdened, and dripping with an expertly crafted layer of exhaustion. After a few superficial questions about my physical health, he quickly steered the conversation toward his own manufactured hardships. He let out a long, theatrical sigh, claiming that my surgical procedure had placed an unimaginable financial strain on his shoulders. According to his narrative, the insurance company had refused to cover a significant portion of the specialized operation fees. He insisted that he was now drowning in a massive hospital balance, a debt incurred solely to keep me alive. He spoke of aggressive collection agencies and how his once pristine credit score was completely ruined because of the astronomical bills. Listening to his weary voice, a deep, misplaced sense of guilt immediately took root in my chest. I genuinely believed his story. I convinced myself that even though he hadn't been physically present in the recovery ward, he had silently sacrificed his economic security to ensure my survival. I wanted to believe that his love was just hidden behind this overwhelming monetary burden. So I started sending him money. At first, it was just modest contributions. I would wire a few $100s from every paycheck, cutting back on my own groceries and basic utilities to ease his supposed suffering. But as my professional career began to accelerate and my income steadily grew, those transfers increased significantly. I was working 80-hour weeks, dedicating my youth to climbing the corporate ladder, all while funneling a large portion of my earnings directly into his bank account. Strangely, his lifestyle didn't reflect the dire poverty he constantly preached about. Social media occasionally offered glimpses into his reality. There were vibrant photos of their luxurious ocean cruises. I noticed Ryan casually posing next to a brand new sports car he had supposedly bought for college commuting. A few months later, Valerie posted enthusiastic updates about a massive, lavish kitchen renovation, complete with imported marble countertops. Whenever I cautiously asked about these extravagant expenses, Alan would smoothly dismiss my concerns. He vaguely labeled their excessive spending as clever budgeting tricks or necessary household investments. I didn't suspect the elaborate deception right away. The truth was too painful to confront, so my mind actively chose denial. I desperately wanted to maintain the fragile illusion that my father was a good man who had given up everything for his daughter. I silenced my own rising doubts and continued to focus on expanding my business. Before long, logging into my banking app and transferring thousands of dollars to Alan simply became a permanent, unquestioned monthly habit. The first person who asked for paperwork was Caleb Norris. He was a forensic accountant at my firm, a quiet, observant man with a talent for spotting numerical inconsistencies. During a late-night project collaboration, he accidentally glimpsed my open banking tab on the shared monitor and noticed the massive outgoing wire transfer. Unlike others who might have judged me, he offered a calm form of emotional support. He didn't pressure me for an explanation, nor did he scold me for sending away a huge chunk of my salary every month. He quietly poured 2 cups of black coffee, sat across from my desk, and gently stated that every hardworking person has a fundamental right to know exactly where their money is going. My immediate reaction was incredibly defensive. I crossed my arms tightly, feeling an overwhelming urge to protect Alan's reputation. I found myself insisting that my father was just managing a heavy financial burden left over from my own health crisis. Caleb listened patiently, nodding without a hint of condescension, before softly asking a few logical questions. He asked what the exact current outstanding balance was. He asked the name of the specific healthcare facility holding the debt. He inquired if I had ever laid eyes on an official, printed billing statement. Finally, he asked why Alan hadn't just forwarded a digitized PDF copy of the original invoice for my personal yearly tax records. Those simple, highly rational questions pierced straight through my years of deep psychological denial. Sitting there frozen under the harsh fluorescent office lights, I suddenly realized the horrifying truth of my situation. I possessed absolutely no formal proof. I had zero legitimate documentation, zero hospital letterheads, and zero collection agency notices in my possession. The only proof I actually had of this supposed monumental debt were brief, vaguely worded text messages and my own extensive bank transfer history. Determined to quickly clear up the rising confusion, I stepped into the vacant, echoing hallway and nervously dialed Alan's number. I asked him very gently if he could please send over a copy of the remaining balance so I could properly track our ongoing progress. Almost instantly, his usually weary, pathetic demeanor vanished completely, rapidly replaced by an icy, aggressively defensive edge. He let out a sharp, wildly dismissive laugh, angrily telling me that I sounded exactly like somebody had been putting ridiculous, toxic ideas into my head. His voice grew progressively louder, echoing harshly through the tiny phone speaker, as he firmly declared that family does not audit family. When I tried to softly press the issue just a little bit further, he immediately pivoted his strategy. He started using Ryan as an emotional weapon to apply intense, suffocating psychological pressure. He vividly described how Ryan was currently struggling badly to find his footing in life, how Valerie was extremely stressed out dealing with the exhausting household chaos, and how the family absolutely needed to stay firmly united instead of turning against each other over silly, insignificant pieces of paper. He deliberately made me feel like a horrible traitor for daring to ask for a basic receipt. I ended the call feeling physically sick to my stomach, my cold hands trembling violently as I slowly walked back into the main workspace. Caleb didn't try to comfort me again or offer any useless, empty platitudes. He took one long look at my pale, defeated face, quietly closed his silver laptop, and pragmatically suggested that instead of waiting endlessly for a phantom invoice from my father, I should immediately contact the hospital's administration department myself to directly request my own comprehensive medical records. The answer came from a file Alan never expected me to request. Within a week of submitting my formal administrative inquiry, a noticeably bulky manila envelope arrived at my apartment containing my complete, unredacted billing summary. Scanning the itemized, densely printed pages, the horrifying reality of the elaborate deception became entirely undeniable. According to the official accounting ledger, my comprehensive health insurance policy had successfully processed and absorbed the vast majority of the exorbitant surgical expenses. Whatever small, insignificant remaining balance existed had been completely forgiven by a generous patient assistance charity program specially designed for young adults in crisis. There was absolutely no lingering deficit, no aggressive collection agencies hunting for payment, and certainly no astronomical out-of-pocket cost secretly weighing down my father's credit score. Sitting quietly next to me in the break room, Caleb meticulously cross-referenced these legitimate hospital documents against my extensive banking history, methodically calculating the devastating final sum on his yellow notepad. We sat in silence as he finally circled the staggering total. Over those long years of blind deceit, I had diligently transferred exactly $86,000 to a man who had effortlessly lied to my face. As I obsessively reread the printed discharge notes, My eyes firmly locked onto a familiar, scribbled signature located at the very bottom of the final page. It belonged to the attending staff member, Janet Briggs. Desperate for any missing context regarding that fateful morning, I intensely searched for her name online and eventually located her professional profile on a business networking platform. I sent a cautious, polite message, honestly not expecting much of a response, but she replied within hours. She clearly remembered my specific case because the surrounding circumstances had been so exceptionally cruel. She explicitly clarified that she wasn't illegally leaking any confidential medical records, but rather confirming a brief conversation she had personally witnessed and properly documented in my authorized patient file. She gently explained that on the morning of my operation, the surgical team had urgently paged my designated emergency contact multiple times. When they finally reached him, Alan hadn't simply been delayed by heavy traffic or terrible parking issues as he had claimed. Instead, he had coldly and impatiently informed the frantic nursing staff, "My wife and stepson need me right now," before abruptly hanging up the phone and turning off his mobile device entirely. The sheer callousness of that exact statement completely shattered whatever fragile, lingering affection I still held for him. Wanting to fully understand the true depth of his endless greed, I made a difficult, deeply uncomfortable phone call to my elderly Aunt Marlene, casually steering the conversation toward our family's economic history over the past decade. Unprompted, she sympathetically mentioned how incredibly hard my father had struggled to pay off the terrible financial burden caused by my spinal condition. I felt physically nauseous as Marlene unknowingly revealed that she had also periodically loaned him massive sums of her hard-earned retirement savings, fully convinced she was helping to clear the very same fake debt. She spoke fondly of his supposed bravery, praising him for shielding me from bankruptcy. He had disgustingly weaponized my physical trauma to simultaneously exploit multiple trusting relatives, covertly funding his luxurious lifestyle and Ryan's extravagant college experiences while constantly claiming complete poverty. I didn't shed a single tear after hanging up with my aunt because my profound grief had rapidly mutated into a cold, highly focused determination. I immediately drove straight to a local office supply store, purchased a heavy-duty legal binder, and spent the entire night methodically organizing every bank statement, text message screenshot, and hospital invoice into a meticulously categorized weapon, preparing myself for the inevitable confrontation. I posted the villa photo on a quiet Sunday because I was tired of hiding good things from people who had never protected me. I uploaded a simple, unedited exterior shot of my sprawling property, perfectly framed by tall palm trees, with a single-word caption reading, "Home." There were no lengthy paragraphs loudly bragging about my hard-earned corporate success, just a silent, dignified acknowledgement of the peaceful sanctuary I had painstakingly built from scratch after being abandoned. Almost immediately, the invisible social dynamic shifted. My father must have seen the striking image on his scrolling feed, suddenly realizing that the very daughter he had continuously bled dry for years was actually thriving far beyond his wildest comprehension. My phone buzzed aggressively and repeatedly with the exact messages I had been strategically anticipating for weeks. The glowing screen lit up with his demanding words, "Jillian, we need to talk," followed closely by a supremely confident declaration, "I'm outside." He foolishly assumed this would be a highly private, emotional reunion where he could smoothly deploy his usual fatherly guilt trips, crocodile tears, and hollow apologies to manipulate his way right back into my luxurious new life. He was entirely wrong. Inside my expansive, naturally lit living room, a formidable assembly of truth was already gathered and waiting in total, suffocating silence. I had intentionally hired a fierce, exceptionally expensive litigator, Nathan Cross, who sat calmly at the glass table with a locked briefcase, fully prepared to forcefully handle any potential legal threats or angry outbursts. Caleb stood silently near the massive kitchen island, heavily armed with the factual, color-coded financial spreadsheets we had meticulously compiled over countless late nights. Janet had kindly flown in across the country for the weekend, perfectly willing to serve as the irrefutable character witness regarding his cowardly, unforgivable hospital abandonment. Aunt Marlene sat rigidly on the velvet sofa, her knuckles white as she tightly clutched her own decimated bank statements, absolutely furious at the man who had ruthlessly stolen her golden retirement years under the guise of family loyalty. Even Valerie and Ryan had been formally invited under a vaguely worded pretense, primarily because the direct beneficiaries of his long-term fraud desperately needed to confront the ugly, unfiltered reality funding their comfortable, carefree lifestyle. They sat nervously in the corner armchairs, exchanging incredibly confused glances, entirely unaware that the lavish foundation of their entire existence was about to be permanently destroyed. I adamantly refused to label this carefully orchestrated gathering as a bitter act of petty revenge. Instead, it was an essential, defining moment of absolute moral clarity. I wanted every single person in that room to finally hear one unified, undeniable version of the truth, permanently stripping away his insidious ability to divide and conquer us with isolated, whispered lies. As I reached out and deliberately pressed the glowing intercom button to unlock the heavy iron gate, watching the grand metal doors slowly swing open for the man who arrogantly thought he could simply walk back in and claim his prize, a profound, permanent sense of closure washed over my entire body. I finally understood that my greatest victory wasn't the considerable wealth I had accumulated over the years, nor the beautiful house I now owned. True, lasting power comes from establishing unshakable personal boundaries and fiercely refusing to let toxic family members weaponize your natural empathy against you. Sometimes, genuinely protecting your hard-won peace means dragging the darkest, ugliest secrets directly into the blinding light, looking your lifelong manipulator right in the eye and firmly closing the emotional door forever, even as you physically allow them to step inside to face their ultimate, inescapable reckoning. When Alan stepped into my living room, he smiled like the house already owed him something. He strutted arrogantly through the foyer with an air of absolute entitlement, his eyes greedily scanning the high ceilings, expensive modern artwork, and custom Italian furniture before finally landing on the heavily populated, unexpected crowd gathered around the large glass coffee table. For a split second, his confident posture faltered, but he quickly recovered, plastering on a warm, entirely fabricated paternal expression as he stepped forward and softly called me his sweetheart. He spread his hands in a placating gesture, smoothly claiming that he simply wanted our estranged family to sit down and have a peaceful, private conversation to heal old wounds. Looking around the room, the varied reactions were incredibly revealing. Valerie looked genuinely startled by the formal setup, her brow furrowed in deep confusion because she obviously didn't possess the full, unedited picture of her husband's deceit. Ryan, on the other hand, shifted uncomfortably in his armchair, rolling his eyes and muttering under his breath, clearly annoyed and visibly operating under the arrogant assumption that I was just being dramatic and overreacting to a minor past grievance. Instead of engaging in a pointless, exhausting shouting match, I calmly folded my hands and nodded toward my attorney. Nathan cleared his throat, his commanding presence immediately silencing the murmurs, and briefly stated that this gathering was not a malicious personal attack, but rather a necessary, documented factual clarification of historical financial events. Without saying a single word, I slid the heavy, meticulously organized legal binder across the smooth table straight toward my father. The thick folder contained every irrefutable piece of evidence: the comprehensive bank transfer history, the official hospital billing summary proving a zero balance, the verified charity care approval letter, high-resolution printed screenshots of his manipulative text messages, the medical discharge notes prominently featuring Janet's signature, and a painstakingly highlighted list correlating my cash wires specifically to Ryan's luxury expenses. Alan's face drained of color as he hastily flipped through the damning pages, immediately stammering defensively that this was all a massive, complicated misunderstanding that could be easily explained. Before he could spin another web of lies, Janet stepped forward, her voice remarkably steady as she professionally confirmed the exact timeline of the surgery day, explicitly recounting his cold refusal to return to the hospital. Immediately following her testimony, Caleb adjusted his glasses and began presenting the raw, unfiltered numbers. He offered absolutely no emotional comfort or padding, clinically pointing out that none of my transferred funds had ever been applied to any legitimate healthcare balance. Instead, he meticulously showed how the dates of my largest wire transfers perfectly matched the exact payment schedules for their tropical cruise, Ryan's sports car down payment, and several undocumented personal loans issued privately to his stepson. The room grew suffocatingly tense as Aunt Marlene finally spoke up, her voice trembling with raw betrayal as she revealed to the group that Alan had spent the last 8 years convincing her that I had selfishly abandoned the struggling family to chase corporate greed. Hearing this, Valerie gasped audibly, her eyes darting between the incriminating paperwork and her husband's sweating face, suddenly realizing the horrifying extent to which Alan had actively lied to her as well in order to maintain his wealthy, flawless facade. I then turned my piercing gaze intensely toward Ryan, sharply asking him if he had ever questioned where the sudden influx of endless cash funding his lavish lifestyle was truly coming from. He quickly looked down at his designer shoes, his guilty, prolonged silence loudly confirming that he could not completely deny his own selfish, willful ignorance. Standing there amidst the shattered remains of his carefully constructed double life, surrounded by the undeniable proof of his exploitation, Alan's shoulders slumped in defeat as he finally, definitively lost all manipulative control over the room. The room did not explode, and somehow that made it worse for Alan. There was no theatrical screaming, no dramatic weeping, and certainly no chaotic shouting match for him to skillfully manipulate or defensively deflect. Instead, there was only the cold, suffocating weight of undeniable truth pressing down relentlessly on his shoulders. Moving with precise professional efficiency, Nathan unclasped his brass-latched leather briefcase and placed a thick, legally binding repayment agreement directly in the center of the glass table. I looked firmly into the eyes of the man who had ruthlessly exploited me for years and laid out my strict, non-negotiable terms. I calmly informed him that every single financial transfer was immediately terminated as of this exact second. He was strictly forbidden from ever contacting me directly again, and I made it perfectly clear that if he dared to continue smearing my hard-earned reputation to our extended relatives, Nathan was fully authorized to instantly file a devastating civil lawsuit for targeted defamation. Desperate to regain even a tiny fraction of his lost control, his voice cracked pathetically as he reached out his trembling hands and whispered, "I'm your father." I didn't flinch, nor did I raise my voice to hurl cruel insults across the room. I simply looked back at him with total emotional detachment and delivered the harsh, honest reality. "You were my father when I was in that hospital bed," I replied softly, but with absolute steel in my tone. "You chose not to be." The fallout from that single statement was swift and incredibly decisive. Valerie stood up abruptly, quietly announcing that she would be packing her bags and staying at her sister's place indefinitely, while she reevaluated the terrifying reality of her entire marriage. Ryan slouched much deeper into his armchair, the grim reality finally sinking in that his endless pipeline of luxury funding had completely evaporated, leaving him entirely responsible for his own rapidly mounting college debts and exorbitant car payments, a crushing burden he had never been forced to manage alone. Before slowly walking out the front door, Aunt Marlene paused to sincerely apologize to me. She broke down in tears, handing over a handwritten letter of contrition, her tired eyes filled with deep, genuine regret for blindly trusting his venomous lies about my character and supposed selfishness. There was no heartwarming reconciliation, no tearful parting hug, and certainly no vague promises of maybe someday left lingering in the tense air. Alan silently walked out of my Naples villa with literally nothing. No more stolen money, no remaining dignity, and zero forgiveness. The very moment the heavy iron gates clicked shut behind him, I officially changed my medical emergency contact, permanently blocked his phone number across all of my personal devices, and instructed Nathan to aggressively intercept any future correspondence. I then walked through my quiet home, finally breathing freely for the first time in nearly a decade, completely unburdened by the heavy, suffocating guilt he had constantly forced upon my shoulders. Sitting peacefully in my tranquil sanctuary, the profound silence felt incredibly healing. Reflecting on this entire agonizing journey, I realized the ultimate lesson was fundamentally about self-preservation and knowing your true worth. Nobody, absolutely nobody, has the inherent right to weaponize blood relations in order to transform you into an endless financial resource. Choosing to forever sever ties with a toxic relative isn't a malicious act of cruelty. Sometimes, it is simply the only viable way to survive and live your life safely. True family members are the loyal people who actively stand by your side during your most terrifying, vulnerable moments in the sterile recovery ward, not the greedy opportunists who only miraculously reappear when they notice you have finally acquired a luxury house. Thank you so much for staying with me and listening to my long story all the way to the very end. Your incredible support means truly everything to me right now. I would genuinely love to hear all your thoughts, or if you have ever had to establish incredibly difficult boundaries with your own manipulative relatives to protect your own mental health, please feel free to share your personal experiences with me down in the comments below.